When you watched the video, could you see like my palette and the painting pretty well, or?
I could see the painting really well.
I'm trying.
Remember if I did see the palette.
Okay. Because, yeah, I'm trying to videotape it in a way where you can see both at the same time. But I haven't gone through and, like, watched my own videos.
Oh, haven't you?
I haven't. I hate the sound of my voice.
I don't like that.
Okay, so today we're just going to be kind of finishing this up. This is basically what we've done so far is we've just blocked in all the major values and the very most basic shapes. So, and my painting is dry, but I am going to go ahead and I'm going to mix up my darkest value again, which is going to be my ultramarine blue with my umber. And I didn't squeeze much of the umber out just because I knew I wouldn't be using too much dark today. So I'm just going to first go back into my tree, and where you can kind of see the underpainting poking through, I'm just going to make my branches a little bit thicker to kind of cover that up. So, and I'm using just like a lot of paint on my brush. And I'm not going to worry about being too precise because it's just a tree, and trees are, you know, they just kind of, exactly, trees just do what they want to do. So I'm not going to worry about like having perfect straight lines or anything like that. Just going to make the branches a bit thicker. And if some of my underpainting is showing, I think that's okay.
Orange sky.
And instead of like going up like this on my branches, a lot of times I'm actually going side to side because I find that that's a better way to control the stroke.
Oh, yeah.
Then, you know, going like this, it's like you start running out of paint. So sometimes, especially on the thicker branches, I actually do really find it easier just to go, you know, even though it almost, I think, seems counterintuitive to do a branch like that because we see a line. But when they're thick, in order to kind of fill up that space, I do find it a little bit helpful to use horizontal brush strokes. And if I go outside where I wanted to, I just decide that that branch is going to be a little thicker. And if you find too, like I'm kind of finding this paint to be a little thick, so I'm going to actually mix in some linseed oil just so it moves a little bit better. And this is part of like I was saying before, I like to work on my paintings while it's all wet, and I think that's just because I'm used to how the paint interacts on top of wet paint, and so it's a little different when the paint underneath is dry. So I think adding some linseed oil will kind of help it move a little bit more. If you start, you know, feeling like you're just kind of scraping against a dry surface. Okay. And then I'm going to do some of these little twigs, but I'm going to use that massing technique that we had done before.
So what kind of technique?
Massing, where instead of trying to paint all these little twigs, I'm going to squint my eyes a little bit and kind of see where all those twigs kind of clump together and form almost a mass.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm kind of squinting my eyes as I look at my reference photo just to see where the small twigs are, you know, forming actual masses. And like I said last week, I am taking some liberties with my composition where I'm making my tree, I kind of pushed the tree in closer to the barn than it really is in the photograph because I want the branches to kind of come over the barn. I just thought that might make a nice composition. So I've got lots of linseed oil mixed in with this paint, so it's a little bit transparent, which you can kind of see on my palette. And since my sky is dry, I can't count on this like mixing in with the colors of the sky, so I do just want to keep it really thin to create a sense of transparency where these masses are. And you don't need to be careful about where you place again because it is a tree, and so there really is no wrong way to paint a tree, and it doesn't need to look like the photo, but just leave, as long as you leave some of the sky kind of poking through, it's gonna look natural. So you don't want to like cover the sky with a bunch of this, dark massing, but. And you might need to, as you work, just continuously, whenever you look at the photo reference, just squint your eyes to kind of remind yourself, where that next point is where you're going to add a lot of mass. Okay, and then one thing too I wanted to show you guys, because next week we are going to do a palette knife painting, but we're going to use our palette knives a little bit this week just to add some texture. So what I'm going to do is, so I have this big pile of paint right here, and there's oil in it, so it's very thin. And I'm going to I'm going to scrape it off so that I have like a beading of paint along the edge of my knife. And I'm just going to start going in and just adding, and I'm not even thinking about like where, these thinner branches are, or even, some of them won't even be actually connected to the tree, but it's really just to give an impression of texture.
And branches.
But this will be a good, I think, practice leading up to next week, even though we'll be using our palette knives next week in a lot of different ways. I'm going to show you different techniques for actually doing like a whole painting with just a palette knife. But we're just basically scratching, is I guess how I think of this, scratching in texture. And it doesn't have to be a lot. Like a little bit of this will go a long way, I think. And I kind of think of this, we have our really thick branches, and then we have these masses of tiny twigs. So I do just kind of think of this as being like that medium, kind of unites the tree with the masses of twigs visually, kind of creates a visual illusion of unifying those elements. But yeah, you don't need to think about where it's going or if everything, logically makes sense and connects to the tree. Just really think of it as texture more than anything. Okay, so now I decided as I looked at this, because I didn't want to paint in this barn. This is actually a calving barn, and I just don't think it's very interesting. So what I decided to do, because it just looks a little too like stark back there, I decided I'm going to put in some distant trees. So I'm going to keep that dark mixture. I'm going to add a little bit more blue. And I might end up adding white, but for now, I'm just going to have a really oily blue, because as objects move to the distance on the horizon, the atmosphere gives them the appearance of being a little bit bluer than they are. So I'm going to put this down, but I might want to lighten it up. We'll see. But I'm basically just going to add like some distant trees Actually, I think that looks okay because it's really thin, so it's sort of allowing some of that sky to come through. Now the camera's facing the wrong way. Okay, we're back. Thank you. Okay. And then maybe I'll just put in a little bit over here, but the sun's really shining through, so I'm not gonna have too much. Okay, and now while I've still got this really oily blue, I'm going to start just looking for other areas that maybe need a little bit more darkness added to them. Like, I think that maybe right here, like at this point, I don't really like to think of this as like painting quote unquote details. I like to think of it as defining certain elements, because you can see right now it looks very blocky, it's very undefined. And so I'm basically at this stage, I'm using the paint to important elements of the painting.
Now, and this, you're using mostly blue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does it have any brown in it?
It does have a little bit, but I barely squeezed any out on my palette, and so
Yeah.
I've used it all up in that initial mix, and I've shadow right there. And I could, squeeze out more of my umber, but at this point I think, because there's not too much in here that's dark, so I'm gonna just kind of stick with adding blue. And I might add some red too. But I'm just looking at things that maybe are kind of looking bland and just creating some contrast. And we'll just start adding a little bit of red. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start working on the barn, because I think that's what's going to need the most definition. So my brush is so the paint is really oily and liquidy, but I don't want too much of that on my brush all at once. So I did kind of wipe it off on my paper towel a little bit, so my brush is a little bit drier. And I'm going to just start defining some of the edges on the barn. I'm gonna wipe it off even more. And when I'm looking at it, it looks like, because there's, what do you call that, where,
Halo.
yeah, and so the roof is kind of coming up over the front of the barn, and so this is,
Arch, kind of, I don't remember what you call it, where is that where they used to like attach a winch? Or not?
I don't know, I know
Or is it just
that is
for-
where we keep hay.
They used to have a winch so that they could lift the
That's
hay.
what I
Right.
thought,
We
yeah.
always, when I was a kid, we had to like be up there and catch the hay bales. So I'm just gonna, I don't want it to be too strong of a shadow, but it is just kind of shadowed where the roof is kind of coming over. And then there's a little bit of a shadow right here too. And then, let's see, I'm gonna use an even smaller brush to start putting in. So the windows are dark and they have that light trim around them, but right now I'm just gonna put in a little bit of dark where some of those windows are. And they're not gonna be perfectly square because my brush isn't square. But again, with Impressionism, we don't need like an exact hard shape. We just want to put a brush stroke down that will, when your eye sees it, it knows that these are windows, even if you look close and they're kind of round. Sometimes you just got to take liberties like that and just work with what you got. Okay. Actually, I think I'm going to add a little bit of dark values down here, even though this part of the painting I don't think is very important or interesting to look at, but I think adding a little bit of darkness down here actually helps make the road up here appear a little bit lighter. Because I thought about lightening the road, but when I really looked at it, I think that the value is right. So sometimes if something looks too dark, you have to just add darker values around it to create contrast. Okay. And then I think the last thing I'm going to do on this is just the trim. I'm not even, there's a like cow in here. I'm not going to paint it. So this trim, even though we know it, we're not going to actually use like pure white paint to paint it just because everything's in shadow. This actually might be too white, but it's basically going to be a light gray because when it's up against these darker values, it's going to appear white. Oh, maybe it does need to be a little whiter. But basically today, because all of these are kind of finer points in this painting, I'm using a lot of this oil, and that just helps make your strokes, especially right now because this brush is a little bit bigger than what you might normally want to use for details like this. So having a really thinned down paint is going to be helpful. And then around the windows, again, I'm not gonna get too caught up in, perfect straight tiny lines. Because with this brush, that's just not gonna be possible. So just like a quick stroke on the sides should be enough. And this will also kind of, if you, like me, if you just have kind of a rounded off brush for the windows, this can kind of help make them a little bit more square. And I think the last thing, I actually squeezed out way too much paint. I think there's some parts of the grass that I'm gonna add some lighter values to. I added some darker values, but there's still some areas that I think need to be more defined.
So that's yellow, blue, and
A little bit of red. And white. There's some white in there because I mixed it into that white mixture I already had. I'm actually going to add more red to make it more neutral because I don't want any, really don't want any, like some of these greens look almost too bright, so I'm going to kind of go over them and mute them a bit. And even though we're doing, details or, defining things, I want to challenge you guys to use a brush that you think is too big. Because I think one thing that really helps a painting, give that impressionist look to a painting is to have really rough strokes to, let those details not be so precise. And so one good way to just kind of push yourself in that direction is to use a brush that just seems maybe a little too big, maybe even a lot too big for the purpose that you're using it. So just want to kind of challenge you guys to, make a conscious effort to do that and just see, what it's like and how it feels.
thing is, I've noticed is when, like after the last class that I was at 2
Mhm.
weeks ago, I went home and worked on my painting quite a bit, and then I'd be gone, I'd come down the next day and I'd, oh, that spot doesn't look right. Well, then I'd mess with that, and then I'd start messing around, and before, then I'd be sitting there an hour, and
Uh-huh.
and by that time, it just lost that quality.
Yeah. So I think one
Yeah.
thing that I had mentioned maybe last week or at some point, or maybe I just thought it, who knows? Sometimes that happens. But you set a time, an hour, just force yourself at the end of the hour to say, no, and I'm not going to fiddle with it anymore. I'm going to just let it be. I'm going to let it dry. I'm going to, even put it out of sight so that you can't walk past it and start,
Yeah.
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 Exactly.
Because then it's
Just put it away,
Yeah, you just lose so much of that.
Yeah,
fresh
because I think,
quality.
right, when you're painting fast and, you're just throwing paint on there and you're working crude, I think it's hard when you're sitting here and you're looking at it and we see all the details in the photos and we kind of want to replicate it. But what gives a painting that really fresh, vibrant look is just kind of, throwing things on there and then just letting it be. So yeah, today I really want to challenge you guys to do that. And if obviously in this class, you guys don't have to paint at home. But if you do, I really do challenge you just to, like in here, you have a time limit just, by default. So I challenge you, if you do paint at home, just give yourself a limit and that's the end of that painting. And then, next time you paint, you're doing a totally different painting.
So are you putting lighter values on now?
I am on the tree. I have a
Yeah.
little bit more yellow and a little bit more red mixed in here. It still is, the same. In this painting, I've only had one pile of paint this whole time, so I'm just kind of using muddy colors. Because again, I had decided that my focal point is going to be the sky and all the colors in the sky. And so everything else,
Doesn't have to be like
right, and to emphasize
lots of color.
right, to emphasize the brightness of the sky, I want everything else to be subdued. But since there's the sun over here, some of it's going to be hitting the tree on this side, so I'm just very subtly adding some lighter, more earthy value to the tree. So it's mostly my dark mixture, and I've just kind of been incrementally experimenting, adding more yellow and red. And it's very subtle. I mean, when I'm looking at it, I barely see, but I think,
That adds to it.
yeah, in a subtle way, it's gonna add to it a little bit, make it look a little less flat.
And it brings the tree out more,
Right.
because you got all the shadows and stuff.
And you can even, take, if you want, experiment with these branches. I think branches are one thing where we can spend like a lot of time on, but I think if you just kind of experiment and
Not be afraid.
let yourself make a mess out of all these twigs, I think that actually adds to that. And I know, like, when I look at paintings of trees, I don't like to see them like perfectly replicated. I kind of like them to be a mess. So, any other questions? That's pretty much it for today. Just go wild though. I mean, don't think of it as details. Think of it as just, defining
Shadows and-
defining some of
Blue and
those
dark
blocky areas of your painting.
shapes.
This was all that whole time.
Really.